Okay, welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us on this call for Backyard Wildlife Habitat Management. My name is Lisa Sawsville. I'm with Vermont Coverts, Woodlands for Wildlife. We are a Vermont statewide nonprofit that works with landowners to educate them about sound forest management and wildlife stewardship. I have with me here Andrea Shortsleeve with the Vermont Department of Fish and Wildlife and Travis Hart, also with Vermont Department of Fish and Wildlife. To talk to you about backyard wildlife management for the next, we'll be together for an hour, but they'll have a short presentation and then we'll be able to answer some questions. I ask that you all mute yourselves so that we don't have the background noise. And if you have any questions, you can type them into the chat box. You open the chat box on the lower bar of your screen, you'll see the little sign that says chat, and then you can put questions in there. And I will relay them to our speakers. I will also put things that they reference during the talk into the chat box, and you will be able to see links to places that they have recommended and be able to go to those places. So at this point, I'll turn over to Andrea to introduce herself and Travis, and then take it away from there. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Lisa. I'm just going to share my screen here. All right, great. Thanks everyone for tuning in. This is kind of an exciting new format that we've done. And I also want to say thank you to Lisa and Coverts for hosting us. Travis and I just want to, let's see. Travis and I are going to, like Lisa said, we're going to give you kind of a quick overview of some backyard habitat basics, and we're going to leave a lot of time for questions. So if you have any questions, hold on to them to the end or type them into the chat box. We're also going to give you a lot of links and resources for you to explore on your own after our discussion's over. Like Lisa said, we both work for the Department of Fish and Wildlife, and habitat management and enhancement is something that we focus on at the department. We focus on quite a bit, spend a lot of time and energy working with state lands and also providing technical assistance to private landowners. And so, you know, we both feel very fortunate to be able to continue doing this right now, even if it's in a virtual setting and not out in the field like we probably prefer. I also want to say thanks to anyone who's bought a habitat stamp from our department, either this year or in the previous years, because you were directly supporting this work to continue doing this. So thank you very much. So when Travis and I kind of started talking about doing the presentation, we were scratching our heads trying to think about like what an average backyard in Vermont looks like, and it's really variable. I took a screenshot from Google Earth of Essex, where I live, and you can see kind of backyards change from a very heavily suburban neighborhood backyard to something that people have, you know, forest blocks lead into much larger continuous blocks that lead into some of the most important wildlife areas that we have in the state, whether it's the Mount Mansfield Forest Block or down the Camel's Hump Forest Block. So our backyards are really important because they are kind of those connecting areas between these larger wild areas that animals and plants essentially move back and forth. So our backyards in Vermont are really the connections to bigger forest blocks, and because Vermont's almost 85% privately owned, our backyards are really an important opportunity for conservation if we design them properly to meet the needs of the wildlife around us. So really, what is habitat? Four big components, basic components, and that's food, water, shelter, and space for animals to move around, and really the arrangement of all those components on the landscape so animals can access them. And it doesn't matter if we're talking about bald eagles nesting in a wildlife management area, or if we're talking about goldfinches kind of, you know, flitting around your backyard. You still need water, space, shelter, and food. So that being said, if we're providing these habitat components and inviting wildlife into our backyards, we really need to be responsible and show a level of stewardship that sometimes we don't really talk about when we talk about backyard wildlife. So you don't want to be creating a situation that's dangerous for them or necessitates wildlife being removed. So bears is probably one of the biggest examples that we can think of, right, pretty quickly. You also don't want to be creating a habitat or something that's going to be dangerous for you or your kids running around. If you're going to be creating a pollinator habitat, maybe not put that next to a playground or an area where your kids or pets are quite often. You also want to be thinking about how to keep your gardens happy. Well, a lot of us spend a lot of resources, a lot of time, planting gardens, and when we start bringing wildlife into those areas, they don't necessarily respect those boundaries. We also want to kind of think about how we're going to keep our neighbors happy. Wildlife likes really messy areas. They don't like mowed lawns and things that look manicured and neat. So a lot of times when we create backyard wildlife habitat, we need to do it in a way that is agreeable to both the wildlife and to your neighbors. And throwing a sign up, kind of explaining what you're doing, often helps to kind of create that awareness of what you're doing. So one thing we do need to talk about before we get too far into creating habitat is the impact that domestic cats have on wildlife. They're one of the biggest threats to birds and small mammals worldwide. There's been some recent studies just that came out just in March, actually, that talk about how the impact of domestic cats have on wildlife. We know that they have about twice to 10 times the larger impact on the local wildlife than natural predators do. And part of that reason is because in neighborhoods, cats have a very dense range, and so they can go out, they can kind of wreak havoc on the wildlife in a much more concentrated area than natural predators. In North America alone, cats kill between 10 and 30 billion wildlife animals a year. And so it's just something to consider when we start creating habitat and inviting birds into our backyards, if we're also creating kind of a population sink for them. So another consideration when we're creating habitat is living in bear country. And frankly, all of Vermont is bear country. Travis and I spoke to our colleagues who are bear biologists, and they said that they get calls for problem bears even in downtown Burlington. So really there's not an area in the state where bears are not an issue when we are inviting them into our yards, essentially. So one of the major things that we recommend in the department is to take down your bird feeders by April 1st. Bird feeders are fine between December and March when the bears are hibernating, but once we get into the spring, bears are moving around and they start getting into some trouble into our yards. Other things include making sure that you put your trash away, using maybe an electric fence or some other kind of security measure to protect chickens if you have chickens, or honeybees in your backyard, maintaining your compost pile so it doesn't smell it, adding a lot of brown material really helps reduce that. And also making sure that you clean out your barbecue grills so they don't have that meat smell after you use them. You know, bears are really smart and they have really good memories. And so as soon as they associate, you know, a shiny black tin can on your porch that's having some good tasty grease, they're going to remember that and move on to the next yard looking for the same thing. If you Google Vermont Fish and Wildlife living with bears, there's a lot of really good hints or tips on how you can protect your yard. So living in bear country is not such an issue. Okay, so now that we have kind of our PSAs out of the way, thinking about an area or thinking about where you're going to start creating habitat in your backyard. And really, you know, it can be as simple as just kind of figuring out what kind of birds and insects and what kind of species you like, and figuring out what kind of habitat they like. You can create a map. A lot of sites recommend creating kind of a planting map, but it doesn't have to be too detailed. I recommend going on either Google Earth or looking at our A&R Atlas to kind of get a bird's eye view, a larger landscape view of what your neighborhood, what your backyard looks like. You're not going to be able to create habitat for, you know, every species out there, especially if you have kind of a smaller backyard like I have. But what can help is if you look around and see what your neighbors have and what is missing kind of in your direct area. So like, for example, if your neighbors have a lot of deciduous trees, it's kind of a more open yard, it might help if you want to create some shade in your yard or plant some conifers, some evergreens to create kind of some structure and shelter during the winter months. I've also included a list really good resources here on the slide, and I think Lisa's going to be putting them into the chat box, that can help you start identifying what's around you. Vermont Invasives has a really good site, and it kind of helps you figure out what plants you have. A lot of landscaping plants have historically been sold that have turned out to be invasive. And Vermont Invasives has a really great site that can help you identify those and then also decide what native plants you can use to replace them. Go Botany, Merlin Bird ID, iNaturalist, all of those are great resources to help start identifying what you have in your area. So one of the biggest components of creating habitat in your backyard is native plants. And we could have a whole nother webinar just on invasive plants, which I believe Lisa is hosting one tomorrow with Ethan Tapper. So I'm not going to go too far into talking about invasive plants other than the fact that 95% of terrestrial birds eat insects, especially when they are raising their chicks. Caterpillars and spiders are the top food item for those little chicks as they're growing. And the vast majority of insects, about 90%, will only reproduce on the plants that they have evolved with. So that's just kind of a long way of saying that if you want birds to be happy in your yard, you need to be planting native plants. Really, when we're talking about wildlife in your backyard, it's not necessarily the presence of invasives, it's really the absence of native plants that can be a real big issue. So the first link that I have on the screen here is from Vermont Audubon, and it's a database that helps you decide what kind of bird-friendly plants to plant in your yard. It's a really slick database. You put your zip code in, you can include what kind of plant you're looking for, whether it's a tree or a shrub or a vine, or you can even just put down what kind of birds you would like in your yard. And it will give you a list of their recommended species and also give you a link to where those plants are sold regionally. There's some other Google links here on the slide that are helpful to look at. One of my favorites is the third one down, the Vermont River Berry Farm. They have a really great pollinator list. I've highlighted it on the slide here. And what I really like about this is it shows not only the plant they recommend, it shows the color that the flower is. So if you're trying to landscape and have something look a certain way at your yard, and it also tells you what time of year those flowers will be out, and what time of year the berries and seeds that those flowers produce will be out. So it's a really helpful tool when you're planning your yard. And then just a word of caution about seed mixes. I know a few years ago, Honey Nut Cheerios sent out with their cereal seed packets, trying to promote pollinators. And unfortunately, a lot of these mixes are not made specifically for our region, and they also often contain invasive plants. California poppy is one of the biggest ones that are definitely in this Cheerios mix, but also in a lot of other prepackaged seed mixes. So I would say, if you're trying to create pollinator habitat, avoid doing this. You can either create your own mixes from just buying separate seed packets. Check out the Xerces website or the USDA plants database. If you ever have a question about what's a native plant or what they recommend, Xerces has a whole kind of database of seed mixes for each region that they recommend. Also, depending on what kind of backyard you have, if you have an area that you would like to just grow into a meadow or an old field, we recommend just letting it grow back naturally. You'd be surprised at the diversity of flowers and pollinator plants that are already in the ground and ready to grow, just as long as they're allowed to. Another really key thing that Travis and I talk about quite a bit to landowners for pollinator habitat is creating young forest or early successional habitat. It's just kind of a gold mine for pollinators when you cut back the forest and let it grow back in the first stages. If you have any questions, please call us about this. We're happy to come out and talk to you about pollinator habitat. And when we talk about pollinators in Vermont, we're not talking about honeybees. Honeybees are kind of the chickens of the pollinator world. They're more agricultural animals than native wild species. And so Vermont, we have 275 species of native bees. Most of these are bumblebees, mining bees, sweat bees, mason bees, and a lot of them are actually ground nesting. So they're pretty solitary. They'll dig tunnels in the ground. Or most of our bees will also use hollow stems like sumac, elderberry, different plants like that that have hollow stems and live in that. Our bumblebees are only social bees. So they're the only ones that kind of form sort of a colony. We have 17 species of those in Vermont, and they live in brush piles, in tree cavities, and other things that you can create in your yard. So I guess with that, I'm going to pass it over to Travis, and he can start talking about how we actually create this kind of habitat that I've been talking about.
All right. I see. I'm going to go relatively quickly through this bit because I know we got lots of people here and there'll be lots of questions. So I want to get to those first, but just to give you a brief overview of some various things to get us started. So Andrea is going to have to move the slides while I talk here, so I'll have to, let her know as well too. But so you go ahead, Andrea. When we're talking about backyard habitat and habitat in general, you saw on the previous slide, there's diversity, structure, a lot of different aspects to it. Diversity is kind of the first one I want to touch on. Diversity is having a lot of different species, a lot of different habitats. The more, the better, basically. There's a lot of species that need certain things throughout the season. Pollinators, like we were just talking about, for instance, it's great to have species that flower throughout the season. Having a variety of tree species as well too that provide different benefits to various wildlife are great to see if you've got a woodlot or something like that. So if you can go to the next slide, Andrea. Some examples of that are mast trees, which are really important if you've got a woodlot, and I deal with private landowners a lot and managing woodlots and trying to improve wildlife habitat in general. A lot of these things are the things you're gonna find, down here in the valley where I am, in Polteny, and in the rest of in the Champlain Valley and the Taconics, and then over in the valley with Brattleboro and those areas, you're going to find more of those oaks and hickories and things like that. Up in the mountains, you're going to find more of that black cherry, yellow birch, serviceberry, that type of thing. One additional thing about a lot of these species too, particularly in the Champlain Valley, but all throughout the state, things like shagbark hickory or big old maples or locusts, things that have loose bark or big cavities or big crevices in them are great places for things like bats to roost as well too. And then also we have plenty of birds, obviously, that need those cavities to roost and nest as well too. Go ahead, Andrea. So when we're talking about different levels, so like we mentioned in the beginning, each backyard in Vermont is going to be a bit different. You got a suburban backyard where things are small. You might have a place where, like I am, where I live in basically the middle of nowhere, which is a lot of Vermont, surrounded by ag land, but then also large blocks of forest. And if you own a big block of forest like that, especially thinking about structural diversity within that forest is really important. So you want to have those different layers kind of that's laid out here in this diagram of the overstory or the canopy, the mid-story, the shrubs, and the ground cover, because they each provide something different for different species of wildlife and different types of wildlife. Another key thing before I forget, especially in that ground cover layer, and something that's relevant even if you have a small backyard, are these dead plants that you can see kind of in that top right picture over there. If you have perennials or something like that, a lot of folks obviously cut those back. It's best to wait until spring, because those dead plants throughout winter provide overwintering sites for insects. They also provide seed for birds and cover for small mammals and other things. So it's best to wait until the springtime to try to prune back or cut back those perennials after all those things have happened, basically. We're going to talk about the other bits of this a little bit more in future slides, so I won't touch too much on those. So go ahead, Andrea. So this is just another slide to illustrate that good structural diversity and some potential things that you might see in those different canopy layers, from your spotted salamanders and turkeys all the way up to your tanagers and other bird species in the overstory of the canopy. Not to mention bats, squirrels, deer in those mid-story layers and shrub layers. Lots of different things. Go ahead, Andrew. So here's just some more examples. So these are some of those other things from the previous slide that I mentioned we talked about a bit more. So if you've got a woodlot, especially, these are important things to maintain and make sure you have across the property. Snags and cavity trees. Snags are just standing dead trees, coarse woody material, or just large pieces of downed woody stuff in the woods, basically large logs. They're going to maintain soil health by keeping the soil moist and putting nutrients back into the soil, but they also provide places like our wood nesting bee species and other things for places for amphibians like our frog friends and salamanders and newts to hide in. And snags are great for a whole host of things. You see the ducks there, but also for things like bats as well too, and small mammals, and then even things as big as fisher or bear potentially, who may find a big hollowed out tree or log and hibernate there. And the rough grouse at the bottom here is a good one to point out too, especially if you're a hunter, because early successional habitat where those big downed logs, those are the places where those grouse are going to like to go and use for drumming logs during the mating time. Go ahead, Andrea. Brush and rock piles are another simple, small thing that you can do. Obviously there's our cottontails and various other species that are going to utilize those. So great little thing that anybody can do, really, and they provide good cover and good structure, and they usually have insects and other things around them so that birds can find them, but they provide great cover especially. Go ahead, Andrea. I already mentioned this a bit, and Andrea did a little bit too as well, but those hollow stems are great for our wood tunnel nesting bees. Those snags are great perches, again, for lots of different animals and also homes for different animals as well too. So kind of this dead, messy stuff is not necessarily a bad thing on the landscape. It's much more of a real big benefit for wildlife in many cases. Go ahead. And then wildlife boxes. So this is something that anybody can do, depending on where you're at. Is going to depend on what you might want to do. Some examples are bats, bluebirds, barn owls, kestrels, and wood ducks. My background is more focused on bats, so that's why there's a lot of bats on this slide. And you can tell, so that bottom picture of the bat house on the barn, I believe that this background picture that I have is the same place. So it's looking up into the bat house, and you can see how they're all kind of tightly packed in there. So a good use of space. And then things like bluebird boxes, we have some here at my house. You'll have those more, you'll have those more in semi-open areas. Kestrels you're going to find in things like Addison County, big farmland, open areas, and then wood ducks, you'll find near water. So that's kind of some examples of there. We'll answer some questions and maybe get into some more details about specifics of those if folks want to later, but we'll keep moving along with this so we have time for questions. Water features are always an important bit. Like I said, with the wood ducks, you want to have those near water. There'll be nest boxes, nest platforms for things like osprey. I'm sure folks may have seen in various wetlands across the state. A lot of these plants that are in wetlands provide great food and great cover. They're tolerant to these wet areas, and they have different zones that they're going to be tolerant to. So you're going to have wetter spots with things like cattail, and you move up through the different zones to our upland forests and fields as well too. But they provide a different level of structure and a level of cover for animals. And those areas that are near the water provide great spots for our turtles and other amphibians and reptiles as well too. Go ahead, Andrea. And then connectivity. So a lot of times when we're talking about backyards, especially, this photo here is from Addison County, and these are points from a bobcat. You can see that this bobcat sticks to where the forest is connected. Forest and shrubland is connected for the most part. Doesn't like to wander too far out. A lot of times when in our backyards, those are the places where these small connections may exist, particularly in the middle of farmland or other areas. So anything that you do in your backyard can be beneficial, especially from a connectivity standpoint to these animals, big or small, which the next slide kind of illustrates a little bit. So those are a bigger scale with blocks of wood and connections through hedgerows and things like that. Where you're going to find things like bobcat or deer or bear or anything else moving, but you have these smaller connections for pollinators. Don't have to be nearly that big. It might just be one patch of flowers to the next, or a few trees that connect to a wildflower meadow or something like that. So thinking in size terms when you're thinking about your own property, your own backyard. What's feasible, basically. You're never going to be able to do everything or get everything on your property or provide everything for every type of animal on your property. But these scales are something to look at to see what matches with your interests and what's doable on your own land as well too. So go ahead, Andrea. So this is something that everybody's probably familiar with. It's pretty obviously a power line cut. A lot of these species, though, are something that you might find in your backyard growing in areas that you don't necessarily maintain. I've got a hill that's just in front of me at this window that's loaded with sumac and blackberries because it just doesn't get mowed or it doesn't get cut. This is sometimes the only early successional habitat that you might find in an area, but it's just a good illustration of some different things. So if you can click through, Andrea. So you might find various species in here. You might find your turkeys that are using open edges and brush to kind of get through. You might find your garter snakes that come out into this open area to bask and search in the underbrush for mice and other things and insects to eat. And then flowering plants that provide for things like your hummingbirds as well too. Go ahead. But the biggest thing and the biggest thing I want to try to get across to folks is that it doesn't have to be expensive or a long-term, high maintenance aspect. A lot of the best things to do would be things that are low maintenance, that are easy to maintain, especially if you're somebody that's working full time, that's trying to make a living in general. You don't necessarily have a lot of time to try to put together the greatest set of habitat and quality improvements that you can. So finding things that are low maintenance, that are easy to put up, to keep track of, what fits your lifestyle, what fits your interests and needs, and what's doable on your property are the best targets to look at. I think with that, we'll go and we'll try to sift through some questions. I know that was real quick and it wasn't a really in-depth overview, but I know there's going to be lots of different questions about all kinds of different things. So we'll get into those a bit now. And I don't know, do you want to start, Lisa, or do you want me to just go back through?
I can read them all, so you don't have to worry about scrolling through. I was just answering someone's question about the links.
Okay.
Someone asked if the links would show up. We are recording this, so they will be in the recording on the slides. I'm not sure about the chat box, but anybody interested can email me and I will send it out to them, and they can send a request to info@vtcoverts.org, and I am putting that in the chat box right now. Let's see. So the most recent question is for the most recent slide on the small scale connectivity. Oh, they wanted to know if you could provide the source for that slide. And they want to ask questions about size and adjacency, but it doesn't provide answers so that we can learn best practices. She wants to know what basically the best practices for her tiny lawn and gardens.
Yeah, that slide is from the Xerces Society, and so you could probably just Google that, or I could also send it to you. About best practices for your tiny lawn, I think, is just making sure that there's borders and boundaries that aren't mowed, that they're kind of continuous around your yard. I mean, there can be little spots where the bugs can fly over, but I think just kind of thinking on a really small scale and making sure that there is connectivity. Wind will have a big impact on how pollinators and other insects can get from space to space. So just kind of considering that and creating some kind of windbreak as well, if you can do that, whether it's a different layer of shrubs or conifers are usually pretty helpful in that respect.
Yeah, and when you're thinking about those really small scales, you're really thinking about those pollinators and your backyard birds that you might do. So, having plants that are going to provide seed and flowering throughout multiple times of the year are great things to have. Even just putting up some simple bird houses or boxes as well too could be nice little additions to a small backyard like that.
Great, thanks. I always talk about reducing people's need to mow, and so giving you a little more free time, so you don't have to mow as much. No recreational mowing allowed. Somebody asked, Heather wanted to know if there are volunteer opportunities to help with some kinds of citizen science.
Ooh, that's a good question. I know that there's some other biologists on the line, so if they have ideas that we don't hit, they can chime in. Through our department, trying to think, we do take scientists with bat observations, the summer turkey brood survey. Thank you, Matt. We also take records of vernal pools, and so does the Vermont Center of Eco Studies. Travis, can you think of any?
I mean, you hit kind of the big ones that I was thinking about. If you have any interactions with bears as well too, or complications with bears, we also have places to report those, and they like to get those so they know where to deal with those types of issues or where to focus efforts. Not really a citizen scientist thing, but another bit. Audubon, I know, has lots of different citizen science type things as well too.
There's a couple of good ideas in the chat box from Sabina and John.
Yeah, the Herp Atlas is one too. So our reptile and amphibian atlas, you can always put information on there. That's something that is maintained throughout the state. Yeah, there's loads of different things. There's not a ton that we directly might do, but there's loads of opportunities throughout the state, and folks are adding a lot of those in to the chat right now as well too.
That's great. Thanks everybody for adding all those in there. There are a tremendous amount of opportunities, and if you just Google citizen science, you'll find a lot of opportunities. There's ones that track monarch flights. That's operated, I think, out of Minnesota. I think it's called Project Monarch. But so there are a lot that are out there. So you need to find something that you're interested in. You could, be overwhelmed by so many. So pick one, and start there. It's the same about, people ask, how do I learn to identify things? Pick one taxa, mammals or birds or reptiles and amphibians or butterflies, and focus on that for one season and gain those skills. So that's a great way to start doing some of those things. We are going to have an invasive workshop tomorrow at 10:30, but someone has asked that they have poison parsnip in their acreage and they can't pull them all, and they really aren't in favor of using herbicide on the poison parsnip. What options might they have?
Yeah, poison parsnip's a real tough one. We have our own on state lands, even we have our own issues with poison parsnip a lot of times. It's like you said, it's if you have a really small patch, like you mentioned, it's easiest to try to pull it in full gear, obviously, so you don't get any kind of burns or anything. But if you've got larger areas and there's no, and you don't really want to go the herbicide route, the best potential that you have is probably to do repeated mowings throughout the summertime and the growing season. And it'll take many, many years, and you have to make sure that after every time, whatever you mowed with is very thoroughly cleaned so that you don't spread it or just bring it back. That's kind of the easiest way that poison parsnip spreads, and you can notice that pretty clearly on the sides of roads a lot of times. But yeah, the best you can do most likely is probably to repeated mowings over a long time over multiple different years is gonna to try to wear it down basically, but it's very difficult.
So I also was wondering if you could touch on the pros and cons of adding trails to your woods. Someone said they have dense woods and they wanted to know if it's okay to put trails in there, and then how to, make those responsible.
I think if that's going to help you enjoy your property, definitely put some trails in so you can use them and get the most out of your land. I think you want to be thoughtful about where you put trails in. Maybe avoid sensitive areas, really wet areas. And then also trails become avenues for invasives and also for predators. So I think, again, just be thoughtful about, how many trail sections you're putting in there and where they're going to go in. I know a lot of neighborhoods have group trails, and so, if you can use those, that's beneficial. And just kind of be thoughtful about how you're doing it.
When talking about improving your woods, and someone says they worry about dead trees that are partially fallen and leaning on other trees. Should they try and get those on the ground? What's the thoughts there?
If they're near trails or areas that people are walking or you are walking a lot, then certainly it's probably not a bad idea. I mean, don't try it yourself unless you have some knowledge or experience in cutting or doing that type of thing, because it's obviously very dangerous. But the only place where it's really a concern is where it's near places where people are going to be actively moving, or it's near a structure that might get damaged, really.
Great. Here's a great question for you too. Are there resources to have people come out and assist, or incentive programs that can assist in building native plant diversity and promoting wildlife habitat?
Yep.
Looking at it.
Yeah, that's myself, Andrea, and a few other folks from the department in different parts of the state as well too.
Yeah, so
as well as our forester partners as well too. I don't want to forget them.
Right. So if you're interested in having someone come out to look at your property, get a hold of either Travis and I, and we'll figure out who the best person to come out to your property is. We have a partnership with NRCS who can help provide funding for different properties. We're doing some activities that enhance wildlife or forestry health. So yeah, the best place to kind of start is just contacting us and letting us know what you'd like.
For sure.
Okay, and then there's a lot of questions on field management, on, are goldenrods good? When should I mow them? So going back kind of even to that parsnip thing, what is this idea with field management?
Yeah, it's
go for it.
All right. Yeah, it's a little bit. It depends on what your goals are. A lot of it. If you need that hay, or you're a farm utilizes that hay, your goals are going to be different than if that field doesn't really need to be utilized in some type of way. So if you have a farm there, certainly mowing twice a year is still fine. I mean, mowing before birds arrive, mowing in that early season before birds really nest, and then waiting, I think it's 65 days off the top of my head, till after most birds have fledged. You can still get a few cuts out of 2 or 2, maybe even 3 cuts off a field if you need to. If you just want to manage it for pollinator and bird habitat, you want to maintain it as field instead of shrubland or something brushier, just mowing it once a year, late in the year after birds have moved on. It's totally fine. You'll keep it as grassy herbaceous cover, and it'll have plenty of structure and flowering plants throughout the year to maintain it. If you want to have a little bit more of a structural component, maybe brush hog it every 3 to 5 years instead. Let some woody material grow back up into it. Kind of depends on what you're looking for and what your goals are, really.
And goldenrods are great late season sources for food for a lot of our pollinators. They kind of stock up before the winter months. So those fields that you see full of goldenrod are really great resources.
Someone was asking about the ladybugs. You know, this time of year they start popping out in our houses, and you know, are those the Asian ladybugs, and have they been overwintering, or they are good ladybugs, and should we be released, you know, trying to get them out of our house? You know, what's the story there?
It's a good question. I don't know the difference.
Yeah.
Off the top
Insects
of my
are
head.
not my specialty, that's for sure. So I don't know as if I could give you a great answer to that.
Maybe someone in the chat box has a good tip on identifying ladybugs versus the native ones.
All right, great. Someone else asked, you know, talked about nest boxes and putting out nest boxes. And there are a couple questions there. One was, you know, they had one used by bluebirds, but a nearby one wasn't. And how might they entice bluebirds to that second one? And then the other question was about barn owls. Do we have barn owls here in Vermont?
Do you want to start with that, Andrea? With you want to take the barn owls, and I can talk more about bluebirds since I have those at my own house.
Great, yeah. I believe barn owls are in Vermont, especially in kind of the more agricultural areas. So down at the Dead Creek Wildlife Management Area, we have a barn owl house that I believe gets used fairly often.
Yeah, and as far as bluebirds go, bluebird nest boxes are interesting. If you have the box too close together, that might be the issue. You tend to want to have bluebird boxes at least, you know, 50 to 100 feet or so apart from one another. Sometimes there just might not be that many in the area as well too. So maybe you've got decent habitat, but they're just, for some reason or another, hasn't attracted the further birds. I have quite a few boxes here on my own property. I've only got one pair that come back to the same box every year, and they nest there every single year. The other boxes have been used a little bit here and there, but they just don't get as much use. So it could be a host of things. It could just be that there aren't that many birds that are utilizing that in the area. It could just be that you have them too close together. Maybe that area is that other one for some reason isn't quite as viewed as quite as valuable by the birds, or maybe there's more predators or competitors that have compromised that specific area. Lots of different things to potentially consider, but maintaining the box and making sure it's cleaned out and it's in good shape. It's not facing prevailing winds, so it's not really a westerly facing opening or anything like that. And that it's kind of secure from nest predators for the most part. That's some tips potentially maybe to help draw in something else.
I always feel good. We have a big bluebird trail on our property too. You know, there's tree swallows in one and bluebirds in another. And, you know, so anything that's kind of using them, as long as it's not, you know, like a starling, then I'm pretty happy about it.
Yeah, exactly.
All right, I have a question about, we hear about climate change. How does this kind of management or thinking about my backyard management, how do I want to think about that in terms of climate change?
Good question, Lisa. I think one of the big takeaways is that we want people to understand that your backyards do matter in terms of facilitating and our movement through climate change and making sure our state is resilient. So I think when you're thinking about planting trees and planting different shrubs, start focusing on or considering, more climate adapted species. There's several lists that are put out that have different species that are predicted to do better in the future as the climate changes. Oak is one of those that we're predicting is going to do a lot better in our forests in the northern parts of the state than it is now. So I would, look into that, look into different species. Also, if you have a habitat on your property that is going to become kind of a micro refuge for animals that are going to be having trouble in the future, start enhancing that. So if you have vernal pools, if you have areas for bats to be during the summer, start enhancing those things, because those are going to be what helps our wildlife move through the future. Also, there's a couple different schools of thought about how to store carbon in your forest and on your property. Young forests and trees that grow really quickly soak up a lot of carbon, sequester a lot of carbon really fast. But then also the trees that take a longer time to grow and are longer lived are going to be storing that carbon for a longer time. So if you have the ability to have both sets of trees on your property, then look for that. I don't know. Also, just being involved in supporting organizations that are working for conservation, like Coverts, like our Habitat Stamp program, Vermont Land Trust, Nature Conservancy. Those are all really good ways to help continue supporting climate change resilience in Vermont.
Great. We have another question, thinking about self-sufficiency. We have gardens now, many of us have chickens. So they kind of would like to know, they have chickens, how do they protect them from predators like foxes? They keep them in a small outside coop, but they still see predators. What's the strategy there?
You want that one, Travis? Or?
I think we both can. It's tough. When you live out especially when you live out in the country, you're going to see things like foxes, coyotes, all the time, particularly if you have animals that are potentially good treats for them. The best methods, really, if you're concerned, or if they're getting into your chicken coop or something like that, oftentimes are making it a not nice place for them to come near, basically. So just noisy things, dogs especially can help a lot of times, because dogs tend to not make things want to come down and look into your coops. But even scaring things away with noisemakers or motion lights or things like that can oftentimes have a big impact on them. Those aren't certainly the only options. I'm just trying to spitball some things off the top of my head here.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Andrea.
Oh, I was just going to say, electric fence are also, recommended in certain areas. A couple of people said motion lights are great around the chicken coop. I would take a look at the Living with Bears link that we have on our website, because even though it's not just bears that you're worried about, it definitely has some tips on chicken coops and helping kind of deter predators to your chicken.
Mm-hmm.
Great. What about, we talk about getting outdoors this time of year, just because it's spring, but also because we're all kind of in our homes now. Can you tell me how I should think about approaching the woods in terms of ticks and how I might reduce their numbers around my property?
Yeah. So ticks are always a big issue anywhere, particularly down here in the southern part of Vermont where I am. Seems like every time I go out, there's a likelihood that I might get ticks. The biggest, the biggest thing is prevention on your part, as far as, I mean, maybe not even necessarily on your property, but if you go into the woods in general, making sure that you check for ticks regularly afterwards. Maybe you shower after you get back from a walk or something like that. Wear treated clothes or use spray of some kind. Those are things that are going to keep you safe first and foremost from ticks, regardless of where you might be, or at least better prevention. As far as around your own house, it kind of depends on what you're looking at. It's going to be impossible to get rid of ticks completely. Ticks are just a part of reality now, but a lot of the things that ticks use and like to quest on, where they hang out and attach to people, are also things that are great wildlife habitat in other ways. Brushy, habitats, long grasses, scrubby, woody, low material. There are shrubs like honeysuckle and invasives especially. So the biggest thing I would recommend is removal of invasives, because that's a big one. Removal of things that help populations that might be vectors for disease and for ticks initial hosts like mice. So if you've got a lot of, if you've got garbage or old vehicles or who knows what flying around, cleaning that stuff up so it's not a harbor for mice is a good suggestion as well too. Maintaining lawns as mowed that are at least the immediate lawn around your house, that are short so that they don't attract more ticks or anything like that. There's lots of different things, but it's the balance between how worried you are about the ticks and how much you want to leave for good wildlife habitat, really.
Great. Thanks, Travis. I do want to mention that UVM Extension is offering their Backyard Woods course coming up May 1st through June 30th. I put the link in the chat box. You can sign up for that. And that's a great program. Actually, Coverts has taken part into that. Fish and Wildlife has, Forests and Parks, to really look at backyard management. And there are activities to do with kids, learning how to design your backyard, to get out in your backyard, identify things in your backyard. So it's a really fun class that's, especially now that we're kind of, in the situation that we're in, that you can get out and really kind of evaluate your backyard. So I suggest if you're interested, you sign up for that program as well, because it'll allow you to take what you heard today and sort of think about how to implement it in your own space.
Yeah. Yeah, and certainly, I know there's no way we'll be able to answer everything in this short period of time, but certainly if you have questions or if you want to try to schedule a time that Andrea, myself, or one of our other colleagues, depending on where you are in the state, could come out to your property and take a look at things or talk with you about subjects, feel free to contact Andrea and I, and we can kind of sort through that and send you to the correct destination. So that's a good opportunity.
Great. Well, we're wrapping up a little bit here as we approach the 11 o'clock hour. I do want to note that if you're interested in hearing more about these kinds of online programs that are going on, Vermont Coverts offers our e-news that you can sign up for on our website, which was in the chat box, but it's easy. It's www.vtcoverts.org. You sign up for that. I'm sharing basically weekly now. It used to go out once a month, what programs are coming up during the week, the following week. And it's not just our programs, it's other conservation organizations and what they're offering as well as I hear about them. They're also posted on our calendar. You're welcome to support Vermont Coverage through our donate button online so we can continue to bring these kinds of things to you. And I want to thank Andrea and Travis for being our guest speakers today on backyard wildlife habitat. So thank you all for participating.
Maybe just quickly at the end here, Lisa, you could put our Andrea and I's contact information in again, just so that folks don't have to search through so much to find that. And I did notice too, thank you, Stephanie, who works with us, asked about the visits. Obviously, right now, with the stay home order, we're not allowed to do site visits right now, but we can schedule something for later on in the year when hopefully this will be over by.
So, yeah, thanks for tuning in, guys.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Have a great day and get outside.
Thanks, you guys.
Oh, hey, John.